So welcome everyone to the first Campus Martius of 2021.
Thank you, Michael, for the thank you, Mike, for the introduction. And I do see some friends here, so it's nice that you all came. And also for those that I don't know, welcome. Michael, I think, just gave me the best opening line for my CV. Jan, more contagious than COVID. That'll certainly get me employed anywhere. So no, but actually, as a relatively new, not so recent, but relatively new dad, I did think that I would start with a dad joke, which I gave my wife the script, and she doesn't actually know the joke. I deleted it before I printed it out. So it is a man with authority walks into a bar and he orders everyone around. Yeah, there you go. So now that I got that out of my system, thank you. So this is not one of the great examples of humor that Michael was talking about. This is just me sitting at my computer yesterday night, okay, I got to start with a joke. All right. So no, I came. It was pretty perfect for the invitation because I just recently came across a philosopher that I think fits perfectly, and he writes very topically about what is happening today. And I have in my whole studies, and this is not the fault of my great professor at the Regina, but I just never heard of his name, and I was like, why does no one talk about this guy? And he's a Hungarian philosopher called Thomas Molnár, who is fantastic. He emigrated to the States, and he published over 40 books in different languages, so mostly in English, I think. But I found a book by him, which I'm kind of heavily draw from for today's talk, for the first part, which is called Authority and Its Enemies. And so I figured, well, I can tie that in, because how he talks about it, I think I can tie that into itinerary. This is not going to take hours, don't worry. This is I've trimmed this down to the bare minimum. So what we associate when we think authority, when I say the word authority, specifically in English, but also in German, potentially also in Italian, is you think of someone that is authoritarian. Okay, authority is not something where I say it and you say, oh yeah, that's great, I love authority. It's not a positive. It's more, and it has a more negative slant to it. It has a negative tone to it, and the reason for that is already that we are living in the fruit of this in a society that is already the fruit of 50 and more years of dismantling authority. Now, authority is everywhere. You have it in your family, nolens volens, nilly-willy. You have it in your family, you have it in your school, you have it in your sports clubs, you have it in any kind of setting, you have it in the church, you have it in the nation overall. There is authority and it exists. Someone is in charge, and if someone is not in charge, then whatever group there is will disintegrate. It will just dissolve. So Molnár, who died in 2010, by the way, so with at 89 years of age, he says authority is something that is rooted in human nature. Authority, listening to authority and having authority in a group is something that is part of the human makeup. It has a clear root in human nature. And so he says that we follow authority not because primarily it has a negative impact on us, so it makes us fear something, it exercises coercion, but because there's a certain consent of the heart. So whenever someone is in authority, if it's a good situation, if you understand why that person is in authority, then we consent to the authority and we follow that authority. He says, quote, ultimately, we consent to it because respect for authority is as a natural response of our whole person, as our love, contentment, pity, pride, and pride of achievement. End quote. So we listen to authority by nature. I think that should be said as the kind of the grand thesis. Now, not just Molnár has said this, Aristotle has said this, as you know, in politics, man is by nature a social animal, and also Cicero have talked about it. And this is what's interesting, is that Cicero actually does not say, as was evidently already part of the thinking, that people only group because of a certain need. Okay, so Cicero posits that even if we have all of our needs satisfied, we will still group together. Quote, what prompts men to unite is less their weakness than the innate need to be in their fellows' company. Man is not made to live in isolation, to wander about in solitude. His nature impels him, even when he has everything in abundance, to unite with other human beings. End quote. This is the first part of the De Republica. Okay, so if authority is part of human nature, what else is part of human nature that's important? Rationality. Okay, authority is not something that you follow despite your thinking. It is something that you follow because of your thinking. Okay, so it is something that is deeply embedded in your rational dimension, and so Molnar calls this the social rationality. And so the social rationality is precisely that: is to congregate, to unite with others, because you think about that someone who is in authority has the right to be in authority. You assent to it, not just because they can punish you, but because you say, aha, if we unite, then we can achieve something greater. And this is going to be the key. So it's a conscious choice, right, of organization. And whenever that is not, whenever authority is not part of a social makeup, then the group will dissolve. And that's what Molnar says. A hierarchical, quote, a hierarchical arrangement without authority invested at each level exhausts itself and becomes ultimately leveled. It vanishes. End quote. Okay. Now, here we have to see then there are two elements of authority that are important to underline in our thinking today, in our concept of authority. Number one, we should understand authority as something positive, not as something negative. As Catholics, it's easier, I guess, because you have someone in charge who is the servant of the servants. So you already presuppose love from that person. So it's easier to assent to that, because you're like, okay, well, I mean, he's serving us. He doesn't make us serve him. Not only, anyways. So it's something positive. But even on a natural basis, it should be something positive. And that's what ultimately also the politician or anyone else in charge should be. He should serve the people. I mean, I don't want to touch another kind of can of worms here, but maybe that's why the so-called populism is so much on the rise, because it is pushed by people who say, look, I'm working for you. Okay, and you hear this, like so-called populists, they do this all the time. They say, I'm working for you. And be it political rhetoric, it doesn't matter. That people react to that means that they don't have the feeling from other politicians. They don't feel like the politicians work for them. They feel like they have to work against politicians. Today, maybe more so than ever. So it's a positive thing. The second is that any authority that wants to be rational needs to bring the group, whatever group it is, to a higher good. And it's a good that you agree on, that the authority agree on, and that's kind of what connects the two levels of authority and you, right? So you need to agree on the objective and on the good that authority leads you to. So what that creates is basically an informed, social, rational authority. Molnar says what happens today, and this was written in 76, so 50 years ago, but I think it's still true. What happens today is that oftentimes when we think about authority, we think about what he calls naked authority, which is the negative aspect of authority. It's the me in charge of something, you have to obey my laws or my regulations, whatever, and if you don't, then I'll punish you. That is naked authority. That is what we look at, and we immediately kind of think about, like, okay, that's not the ideal. That is not, that may be necessary, but it's not the ideal. So what we have to have instead is an informed and rational authority, which is that everyone in a group seeks the good of the group by way of the person that is in charge. Okay, so therefore, and this is kind of the end of the first part, we can sum up the functions of authority. Number one, authority grants a group that every individual in the group is free in and of themselves, but still part of the group. So it's a mediator between your individual freedom and the group, the social group that you're part of. And one. Number two, authority structures inequality. So in a group, all interventions arise from free members and can be turned against one another. if the structure of the group is not upheld. That's why there is an inequality. So authority is in charge of managing that inequality and saying, okay, well, we have to, change this structure or change this relation, and therefore we can deal with inequality. Not necessarily eradicating inequality, that would not be possible, but managing it, right? Making sure that it doesn't get too extreme. Okay. And the third, and this is obviously then also where kind of the theological, the theology comes in, is that authority needs to lead the group to the higher good, so to the transcendental good, whatever it may be. Again, as Catholics, for us, that's easier to understand, but even not the higher law, be it natural law or Catholic sense of salvation, is what authority should do. Okay, so much for authority. Now, the enemies of authority. What do the enemies of authority do? And this is more like the Inferno part of the Divine Comedy, right? So now I just talked about Paradiso, so now comes the Inferno. That obviously is much more like beefy and more interesting. People who want to attack authority do that by placing an image of the, appunto, authoritarian leader in the fashion of, let's say, Mussolini in your head as a straw man, or that. Quote, a man who makes a fetish of a certain attitude, which we mean when we say he throws around his weight, a man whose every manifestation oozes orders and commands. If we try to visualize him, we think of a firm-jawed, strong man with severe eyes and stony features, unbending to human motivations, inscrutable, unapproachable, and ruthless. This picture, modeled after the anti-fascist caricature of Mussolini, is not only false, says Molnar, but is also childish, because it is superficial and biased, end quote. So the authoritarian, and this is a good point, because this rhetoric has been around evidently for a long time. My grandmother always used to mock the Nazi ideology, and she was definitely not a Nazi. She said, yeah, you have to be Aryan, right? Which is blonde as Hitler, tall as Goering, and tall as Goebbels and slim as Goering. Okay. It's like if you look at Hitler and then you have the Aryan ideal, you're like, okay, this is not, how is this man talking about these tall, blonde, mythical kind of creatures that are supposed to be the Aryans? So whatever image you have of the authoritarian leader, whatever it may be, Molnar talks about Mussolini, I could identify myself with that, but maybe you have another one. That's the straw man, right? And so much of the straw man actually roots in the analysis of history of the whole 20th century, of the diagnosis of the anti-authoritarians of the 20th century. They say, quote, the misery of this age takes its cause from the rightist regimes in power in Europe between the 1920s and 1945. These were totalitarian regimes, successful because they gave a political expression to a dangerous streak in the upbringing of generations according to traditional authoritarian methods, end quote. And therefore, the process of enlightenment that had started with enlightenment in the different countries, whatever it may be, France, England, Germany, was blocked. Right? So enlightenment ended when those totalitarian regimes took hold. Okay, so that's the diagnosis of the 20th century. Out of that, you built a straw man that's the enemy. So this is this Mussolini-like authoritarian leader. Okay, and now we have kind of we're at a crossroads, right? We have to choose here. We have to say, okay, so what is our solution to this? If this diagnosis is correct, how can we go a different path? And so one solution would be to return to a family-based structure, right? So then you have like a family structure, you have a father in charge, whatever, and then you have the next larger, you have a village, and all of that with a clear authority. That evidently is abolished by anti-authoritarian thinkers. This is old, retrogressive, and medieval. So, what we have to do instead, we have to take the other road. And that other road reduces and erodes authority of the father, the teacher, the priest, the judge, the army officer, head of state, or whatever. Only then can the new man arise. So this new man will be anti-authoritarian in essence, defiant of authority, democratically minded, cooperative, tolerant, and truly free. So, this new man can arise because that's what the essence of man was all along, before it got corrupted. Right? So man can finally come to himself, be free. If you're familiar with Eric Voegelin, then you know that this kind of irks of Gnosticism. The true self. You know, you're not your true self. See, you don't know because you lived in a historic condition that conditioned you a certain way to think. You have a certain way to think. You're not understanding what's going on. You have to discover your true self from within, right? And we're going to be the leaders that bring that out. The new man, right? The new man. Okay, so that's where we want to go. So the enemies of authority are opposed to authority in a very specific way, not just shooting at it from all different angles. I mean, they do that as well, but very specifically, they say, and this is the key, they say that following authority is non-rational, is irrational. So in order, if man is rational and man has to follow his nature, follow authority is non-natural because it would be irrational. Because look at Mussolini, what he did, that was crazy. Or look at Hitler, what he did, that was crazy. Or Stalin, whatever, that was crazy. So you need, this new man is clearly anti-authoritarian and therefore the true rational. And so Molnar criticizes and he says, quote, "This line of argumentation must be called ideological because it fastens upon a certain interpretation of current history, by no means adequate, then extrapolates this interpretation so as to validate it for the nature of man. The second unwarranted conclusion." End quote. Okay. What's an example of this? And so now I'm going to give you kind of more historical kind of pinpoint here, which is the Frankfurt School. And that's why the presentation is called Neo-Marxism. It's the Neo-Marxist Frankfurt School. And so the most notable current today is, that's still very omnipresent, you'd be surprised, is the Neo-Marxist and anti-authoritarian thought of the Frankfurt School of Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, who also influenced thinking in the States up to a certain degree. And they exactly posed that question. They said, why is it that after the age of Enlightenment and Marx, now that the industrial society was finally a rationally organized one, and first in history, the world was still producing an abundance of authoritarian personalities, leaders and followers? And so here it reappears that straw man of the inflated authoritarian personality, which is blind, right, mechanical, superstitious, rigid, cynical, whatever you may call it. And so in order to dismantle all of this, they developed something that is called the critical theory, which is supposed to be scientific and, quote, serves to, quote, the destruction of authority and its replacement by anarchy, itself leading to naked power over depotentiated and destructed individuals, end quote. This is what's so fascinating, is that in the development of all of this, man gets so disintegrated and so detached from authority that after you're done with that process, he's lost and he doesn't know what to do. And so he's going to follow the next person that tells him, okay, like, follow me now. Wait, did we try to overcome that? Okay, so what happens is that this man now that is destructed and depotentiated is lost and needs help because it is natural for a human being to look for authority. So they now lead those very people who taught him that. And that's a very famous anecdote of Adorno that 3 weeks before he got a heart attack and died, one of his students came up to him, two or three girls came up to him, kind of ripped their clothes off in front of him and, you know, decried him as like the new imperialism. And he was surprised by that. It's like, you created these people. Okay, so instead of rethinking their presuppositions and checking their prejudices, these critical theorists, they said, we need to overcome this authoritarian leader. And so it's formulated in kind of like a thesis, if you will, which would be the thesis of anti-authoritarian thought, which is, quote, every civilization and its subsections, the institutions, is repressive, and the child is born a victim of forces he can never control, neither now nor in his adulthood. Man was born free, yet he's everywhere in chains, as Rousseau put it, labeling once and for all the anti-authoritarian attitude. The only chance of changing the civilization into a utopia is to set the child above all the child, the still malleable being, free and released of constraints. End quote. That could be from like a newspaper article published on the World Economic Forum on the website today. Like, just write that. This is the narrative, this is the rhetoric that has been used. Look at critical race theory. Critical race theory, that's what it is. It's critical theory. It's saying, I'm going to reduce the individual to whatever background they're from, right? Identity politics, depotentiate him, and then kind of make him lost, and then I empower him in the way that I want to. And he'll follow me because authority is natural. Okay. So what are some of the strategies taken? And I don't think that I need to explain them at length, but is first of all the destruction of the family, the most kind of natural place of authority, and then the destruction of every social group in society to establish an absolute domination over a crowd of individuals no longer protected by autonomous institution, be it the dissolution of subsidiary groups, so political opponents, think tanks, media outlets, or the disintegrating of social fabric, schools, universities, clubs, and so forth. And then also the fragmentation of authority. So setting children against parents, students against teachers, soldiers against officers, and ultimately people against people in charge or in a place of authority. Okay, and here again I return to this kind of scare buzzword is coercion, right? If you don't follow this, then you are following this idea that authority that can exercise coercion, which is obviously intrinsically evil, okay, as anti-authoritarians would say, that you agree with that, which makes you irrational. Okay, so you're not a real human being. And oftentimes, in order to evoke this image, there's always the talk of the naked authority, quote unquote, so torture, repression, and all of the things that are naturally repulsive to you, to everyone who would listen to these ideas. Okay, so that's the Frankfurt School. Now, I have time. Yeah. So now let's apply this to the Great Reset, and this is kind of the weird thing that I also, if you would, I have to like sum it up in one sentence. That's what's hard to explain. Is what basically happens is that people who want to be in charge need to tell the subjects that no one should be in charge first, because they need to create a situation in which they can take power. Now, what is happening, and you can see this, I think, today pretty well, is that people just don't catch up with that thought. So whenever, like, politics seems to be always a step in advance to what people actually live through. And by the time that people actually reach to the point what politics dictates, then politics has already changed, and people said, when they said here, they said, well, we're not going to be super happy here potentially, but okay, let's go here. And then I say, yeah, no, this is not really, oh, but politics is here. Okay, so now we go here. And so once you get here, it's like, okay, I don't know if you're happy here, politics is already here. It's kind of a cat and mouse game here. So what's happening? That political rhetoric is utopian, which means that it points to a point in the future which cannot be reached. There is, and I'm sorry, now I'm going to get preachy, but this is something that people, as if I had not been preachy before, you have not seen me in full preach mode yet. It will be over when we get the certain infection rates down to under 10 in Germany. It will be over when everyone wears masks. It will be over when we get a vaccine. It will never be over. That's what people don't understand. This is the problem, is that it is a utopian rhetoric. And this, like Merkel is, if you want a great example, is just look at Merkel. It's amazing. It's like to the T. You can study her. Like everything that she says is exactly that. It is always looking to the future for the solution. The new, and again, the basis is the new. I say, oh yeah, and this is what's crazy is that people actually listen to this and they say, oh yeah, it's my fault. I have not been distant enough. I have not been home enough. I have not worn the mask enough. It's because people are naturally authoritarian. They want someone to tell them what to do. Okay, preach mode off. All right, so utopian society. Now, utopian society is basically that conglomeration that, and that's why I use a topical example, which is the Great Reset, is what proposes this new man, the liberated individual, the man that has come to his true self. You can point whatever. I mean, there's so many that I don't want to go in detail, but it's the fourth industrial revolution, right? You have transhumanism, you have socializing private property, you have digitalization of human affairs, you have, including currency, obviously, and ideally universal basic income, right? Okay, so this is from a recent article by Hilary Sutcliffe from August 2020. Quoting a book by Rutger Bregman, which is called Humankind, A Hopeful History. He also wrote Utopia for Realists. And so she says this, quote, his research over 200,000 years of human history shows that we are in reality hardwired to be kind, cooperative, and caring. He shows that when the negative assumption changes, everything changes. And he uses real-world examples from the Norwegian prison system to a real-world Lord of the Flies. So Sutcliffe, this lady, sums up, quote, this book shows that our view of the world was simply made up, and made up by a surprisingly small but depressingly influential number of individuals, from Machiavelli and Adam Smith to Milton Friedman and William Golding. But if we made it up once, we can make it up again. And there are plenty of people out there with great new ideas to work with if we started to take them seriously. End quote. Another great example that this book brings up is that war is not wanted by the people, but only by the authoritarian leaders. And the author brings up the First World War example of the truce on Christmas Day 1914, which was new to me, but maybe the historically versed among you already know this, where there was a truce basically between the sides for Christmas, and then they had a soccer game, they played a football game together. And so the book says, quote, it could have easily escalated into a full-scale peace, as both sides were reluctant to restart. Only the dogged perseverance of generals far away who used propaganda to stir hate and instill obedience through orders to court-martial anyone for friendly gestures towards the enemy managed to kickstart the war again. End quote. Listen to this again. Only the dogged perseverance of generals far away who used propaganda to stir hate and instilled obedience through orders started the war. I'm just reading this and thinking, okay, who are the far away like generals who we don't know and who propaganda and hate stirring, instill obedience in their subjects? I think you are kind of criticizing the wrong people here from your very high pedestal. So the point of this utopia is if we all work together, naturally according to the parameters of the World Economic Forum, then there will be no war and we'd all live in cooperation and peace. Okay, so there's your example, and I invite you to, I'm sorry, the article that I had as a suggested reading by Rod Dreher was good, but there are many more, and when Michael told me to choose one, I chose one that was based more or less on the subject and lengthwise was acceptable. The video is very interesting. I think, I don't know if the ones that you've seen, I do invite you to watch the video. That's basically the summary of the World Economic Forum's idea, and it's quite scary. I mean, you watch it and you kind of after that I had to swallow after watching that because it's so blatant that it's almost unbelievable. Okay, now to close, I want to go to the origins of this new utopia based on what I've said before. And so, as I said, in the Great Reset, many things that we can attack. I'm going to kind of hone in on two. Number one, the overcoming of the hardship of manual labor through digitalization, robots, smart working, whatever, you have it. And the second, which may be a little bit far-fetched, but hear me out, is the overcoming of the pain of birth. Children, right? So this could be through artificial means, the artificial womb, which already exists, is financed by the EU, or the abolishing of births completely by contraception and then abortion. By focusing on these 2 points, the utopian lookout poisons the very heart of human makeup. Why? Quote, "To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to the man he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and you have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it, and all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." End quote. What this utopia consists of is wanting to eradicate the 2 effects of original sin. The problem is these 2 effects cannot be eradicated by man. They cannot be eradicated in an immanent way, but only in a transcendental way. So with the help of God and grace and all of that. So if the utopian ideal is the woman who's freed from the burdens of childbirth, whatever means possible, and the man who's redeemed from labor, and only that is the ideal man which is truly free and has come to himself, then this is the recreation of mankind in the image of their creator, man. So, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jan.